From the Tanglewood Tales, The Pygmies, Part 2. Ho, 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 quoth the giant, shaking his mountainous sides. What a funny thing it is to be little. If I were not Antius, I should like to be a pygmy, just for the joke's sake. The pygmies had but one thing to trouble them in the world. They were constantly at war with the cranes, and had always been so, ever since the long-lived giant could remember. From time to time, very terrible battles had been fought, in which sometimes the little men won the victory, and sometimes the cranes. According to some historians, the pygmies used to go to battle mounted on the backs of goats and rams, but such animals as these must have been far too big for pygmies to ride upon. So that I rather suppose they rode on squirrel back, or rabbit back, or rat back, or perhaps got upon hedgehogs, whose prickly quills would be very terrible to the enemy. However this might be, and whatever creature the pygmies rode upon, I do not doubt that they made a formidable appearance, armed with swords and spear, bow and arrow, blowing their tiny trumpets and shouting their little war cry. They never failed to exhort one another to fight bravely, and recollect that the world had its eyes upon them, although in simple truth the only spectator was the great giant Antius, with his one great stupid eye in the middle of his forehead. When the two armies joined battle, the cranes would rush forward, flapping their wings and stretching out their necks, and would perhaps snatch up some of the pygmies crosswise in their beaks. Whenever this happened, it was truly an awful spectacle to see those little men of might kicking and sprawling in the air, and at last disappearing down the crane's long, crooked throat, swallowed up alive. A hero, you know, must hold himself in readiness for any kind of fate, and doubtless the glory of the thing was a consolation to him, even in the crane's gizzard. If Antaeus observed that battle was going hard against his little allies, he generally stopped laughing and ran with mile-long strides to their assistance, flourishing his club aloft and shouting at the cranes, who quacked and croaked and retreated as fast as they could. Then the pygmy army would march homeward in triumph, attributing the victory entirely to their own valor and to the warlike skill and strategy of whomsoever happened to be captain general. And for a tedious while afterwards, nothing would be heard of but grand processions and public banquets and brilliant illuminations and shows of waxwork with the likeness of distinguished officers as small as life. In the above described warfare, if a pygmy chanced to pluck out a crane's tail feather, it proved a very great feather in his cap. Once or twice, if you will believe me, a little man was made chief ruler of the nation for no other merit in the world than bringing home such a feather. But I have now said enough to let you see what a gallant little people these were, and how happily they and their forefathers, for nobody knows how many generations, had lived with the immeasurable giant Antaeus. In the remaining part of the story, I shall tell you of a far more astonishing battle than any that was fought between the pygmies and the cranes. One day the mighty Antaeus was lolling at full length among his little friends. His pine tree walking stick lay on the ground close by his side. His head was in one part of the kingdom, and his feet extended across the boundaries of another part, and he was taking whatever comfort he could get, while the pygmy scrambled over him and peeped into his cavernous mouth and played among his hair. Sometimes, for a minute or two, the giant dropped asleep and snored like the rush of a whirlwind. During one of these little bits of slumber, a pygmy chanced to climb upon his shoulder, and took a view around the horizon as from the summit of a hill, and he beheld something a long way off, which made him rub the bright specks of his eyes and look sharper than before. At first he mistook it for a mountain, and wondered how it had grown up so suddenly out of the earth. But soon he saw the mountain move. As it came nearer and nearer, what should it turn out to be but a human shape? Not so big as Antius, it is true, although a very enormous figure in comparison with the Pygmies, and a vast deal bigger than the men whom we see nowadays. When the pygmy was quite satisfied that his eyes had not deceived him, he scampered as fast as his legs would carry him to the giant's ear, and stooping over its cavity, shouted lustily into it, "Hello, brother Antius! Get up this minute! Take your pine tree walking stick in your hand! Here comes another giant to have a tussle with you!" "Pooh, pooh!" grumbled Antaeus, only half awake. "None of your nonsense, my little fellow. Don't you see I'm sleepy? There is not a giant on earth for whom I would take the trouble to get up." But the pygmy looked again, and now perceived that the stranger was coming directly toward the prostrate form of Antaeus. With every step he looked less like a blue mountain, and more like an immensely large man. He was so nigh that there could be no possible mistake about the matter. There he was, with the sun flaming on his golden helmet and flashing from his polished breastplate. He had a sword by his side and a lion's skin over his back, and on his right shoulder he carried a club which looked bulkier and heavier than the pine tree walking stick of Antaeus. By this time the whole nation of pygmies had seen the new wonder, and 1,000,000 of them set up to shout all at once, so that it really made quite an audible squeak. "Get up, Antaeus! Bestir yourself, you lazy old giant! Here comes another giant, as strong as you are, to fight with you." "Nonsense, nonsense!" grumbled the sleepy giant. "I'll have my nap out, come who may." Still the stranger drew nearer, and now the pygmies could plainly discern that if his stature was less lofty than the giant's, yet his shoulders were even broader. And in truth, what a pair of shoulders they must have been! As I told you a long while ago, they once upheld the sky. The pygmies, being 10 times as vivacious as their great numbskull of a brother, could not abide the giant's slow movements, and were determined to have him on his feet. So they kept shouting at him, and even went so far as to prick him with their swords. "Get up, get up, get up!" they cried. "Up with you, lazy bones! The strange giant's club is bigger than your own. His shoulders are the broadest, and we think him the stronger of the two." Antaeus could not endure to have it said that any mortal was half so mighty as he. This latter remark of the pygmies pricked him deeper than their swords, and sitting up in rather a sulky humor, he gave a gape of several yards wide, rubbed his eyes, and finally turned his stupid head in the direction whither his little friends were eagerly pointing. No sooner did he set his eye on the stranger than, leaping to his feet and seizing his walking stick, he strode a mile or two to meet him, all the while brandishing the sturdy pine tree so that it whistled through the air. "Who are you?" thundered the giant, "and what do you want in my dominions?" There was one strange thing about Antaeus of which I have not yet told you, lest, hearing of so many wonders all in one lump, you might not believe much more than half of them. You are to know, then, that whenever this redoubtable giant touched the ground, either with his hand, his foot, or any other part of his body, he grew stronger than ever he had been before. The earth, you remember, was his mother, and was very fond of him as being almost the biggest of her children, and so she took this method of keeping him always in full vigor. Some persons affirm that he grew 10 times stronger at every touch. Others say that it was only twice as strong. But only think of it. Whenever Antaeus took a walk, supposing it were but 10 miles, and that he stepped 100 yards at a stride, You may try to cipher out how much mightier he was on sitting down again than when he first started. And whenever he flung himself on the earth to take a little repose, even if he got up the very next instant, he would be as strong as exactly 10 such giants as his former self. It was well for the world that Antius happened to be of a sluggish disposition, and liked ease better than exercise. For if he had frisked about like the Pygmies and touched the earth as often as they did, he would long ago have been strong enough to pull down the sky about people's ears. But these great lubberly fellows resemble mountains, not only in bulk, but in their disinclination to move. Any other mortal man, except the very one whom Antaeus had now encountered, would have been half frightened to death by the giant's ferocious aspect and terrible voice. But the stranger did not seem at all disturbed. He carelessly lifted his club and balanced it in his hand, measuring Antaeus with his eye from head to foot, not as if wonder smitten at his stature, but as if he had seen a great many giants before, and this was by no means the biggest of them. In fact, if the giant had been no bigger than the pygmies, who stood pricking up their little ears and looking and listening to what was going forward, the stranger could not have been less afraid of him. "Who are you?" roared Antaeus again. "What's your name? Why do you come hither? Speak, you vagabond, or I'll try the thickness of your skull with my walking stick." "You are a very discourteous giant," answered the stranger quietly, "and I shall probably have to teach you a little civility before we part. As for my name, it is Hercules. I have come hither because this is my most convenient road to the garden of Hesperides, whither I am going to get 3 of the golden apples for King Eurystheus. And as we're running a little long, I think we'll stop here and continue with this story of Antaeus and Hercules in the next video. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've clicked like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now. I love you guys. Bye-bye.